When they came, we did not hear them until it was too late. The hooves sounded like distant thunder, like a storm rolling across the steppe, and by the time we understood what that sound meant, the sky was already darkening with smoke. Our village had stood for generations, built along a river that brought life to the dry lands, protected by wooden walls that our grandfathers had raised with their own hands. We believed those walls would keep us safe. We believed that the stories we had heard, the whispers of an army that moved like wind and struck like lightning, were exaggerations meant to frighten children. We were wrong. They broke through the gates before noon. I was in the market with my sister, carrying bread we had baked that morning, when the first screams reached us. We turned and saw the horsemen pouring through the streets like floodwater, their armor catching the light, their faces hidden behind leather and fur. My sister grabbed my hand. We ran. Everyone ran. But there was nowhere to go. The streets were narrow, tangled, designed to confuse invaders. But these men did not need roads. They rode over gardens, through doorways, across rooftops. They were everywhere. My father tried to stand between us and them. He was not a soldier. He was a potter, a man whose hands shaped clay into bowls and jars, whose greatest violence had been killing a snake that had crawled into our home one summer. He held a wooden staff and shouted at the riders in a language they did not understand or did not care to hear. One of them rode past him without slowing, and my father fell, and I did not see him rise again. My sister and I were pulled from the doorway where we had tried to hide. Hands grabbed our arms, our hair, our clothes. We screamed. Everyone screamed. But the screaming stopped mattering very quickly, because no one was coming to help. The men of our village, the ones who had not already fallen, were being herded into the central square. The women and children were separated, pushed into groups, our hands bound with coarse rope that cut into our wrists. I looked for my mother in the chaos. I found her across the square, her face bruised, her dress torn, her eyes searching for me the same way mine searched for her. She mouthed something I could not hear. I think it was my name. And then the soldiers moved between us, and I did not see her again. We were taken east. That is what they told us through translators, who spoke our language with strange accents, men who had once been like us, captured in other villages, other kingdoms, other lives, and who now served the Khan because serving meant survival. They told us that resistance was death, that obedience might grant mercy, that we belonged to the Mongol Empire now, and the Mongol Empire stretched farther than we could imagine, and there was no home to return to because our homes no longer existed. The journey across the steppe felt endless. We walked for days, then weeks. Some of us were tied to carts that carried supplies, forced to stumble alongside horses that never seemed to tire. Others walked in long lines, ropes connecting us like beads on a thread, so that if one fell, we all felt the pull. The wind was cold, colder than anything I had known. It cut through our thin clothes and found the skin beneath, turning our fingers blue, our lips cracked and bleeding. At night, they allowed us to rest, but rest was not the right word. We collapsed where they told us to collapse. We huddled together for warmth. The women who had been taken from villages before ours whispered advice in languages we did not share, but whose meaning we understood through gestures and eyes that had seen too much. Do not resist. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not look them in the eyes. Do not cry where they can see you. One woman, older than my mother, with grey hair that had come loose from its braid, whispered prayers every night. I did not know her God, but I listened to the rhythm of her words, the way they seemed to hold her together when everything else was falling apart. She prayed for the dead. She prayed for the living. She prayed for strength to endure one more day. On the 8th night, she did not wake. We left her body by the side of the road because we were not allowed to stop. We arrived at the camp during a storm. Rain lashed the plains, turning the ground to mud, and through the sheets of water I saw the yurts, dozens of them, arranged in precise rows. There felt walls dark and solid against the chaos of the weather. Smoke rose from fires that somehow stayed lit despite the wind. Horses stood in pens, their heads low, unbothered by the rain. And everywhere there were soldiers. More soldiers than I had ever seen, more than I had imagined could exist in one place. We were brought to the center of the camp and made to stand while men walked among us, inspecting us the way one might inspect livestock at a market. They touched our faces, pulled back our hair, checked our teeth, our hands, our bodies. Some women were pulled aside immediately, others were left standing. I was pulled aside. My sister was not. She reached for me, her eyes wide with panic. But the rope between us was cut, and she was led in a different direction, and that was the last time I saw her. They took my name that day, not with words, but with silence. No one asked what I was called. No one cared where I had come from or who I had been. I was given a place in a yurt with 7 other women, all of us captives, all of us stripped of the markers that had once defined us. We were fed once a day, thin soup with grains that sat heavy in the stomach. We were given tasks, hauling water from the river, scrubbing pots, mending clothes and tents, tending to the horses that were treated with more care than we were. The days blurred. One morning looked like the last. One task bled into the next. We learned quickly which soldiers to avoid, which ones struck without warning, which ones could be appeased with silence and lowered eyes. We learned the sound of footsteps, the weight of boots on packed earth, the difference between a patrol passing by and someone stopping outside our yurt. Nightfall was the worst. During the day, we could lose ourselves in work, could focus on the task at hand, could pretend that we were simply servants, that this was a life we could survive. But at night, when the camp grew quiet and the fires burned low, we heard things. The creak of tent flaps opening, the soft sound of weeping, the silence that followed certain footsteps. We did not speak about it. Speaking would make it real in a way that silence allowed us to deny. We lay in the dark, pressed close together, pretending to sleep, praying that tonight would not be the night the footsteps stopped outside our tent. There was a woman among us named Oyuna. She had been taken from a city to the west, a place she described as having walls so high you could not see the top, towers that touched the clouds, markets where merchants sold spices and silks from lands so distant they might as well have been myths. She had been the daughter of a minor lord, educated, literate, someone who had expected to marry a man of equal standing and live a life of comfort and order. Now her hands were raw from washing, her back bent from carrying, her voice reduced to whispers in the dark. Oyuna was the one who taught me the rhythm of survival. She taught me to move without drawing attention, to speak only when necessary, to keep my face blank when the soldiers looked at us. She taught me that emotions were luxuries we could not afford, that anger was dangerous, that hope was even more dangerous, that the only way to endure was to become a ghost in your own body, present but not present, alive but not living. "Do you think they will ever let us go?" I asked her once, during one of the rare moments when we were alone, carrying water buckets back from the river. She did not answer immediately. She stared at the horizon, at the endless flatness of the steppe, at the sky that seemed too wide, too empty, as if the world we had known had been swallowed, and this was all that remained. "No," she finally said, "they will not let us go, but if we are clever, if we are silent, if we make ourselves useful, we might live long enough to see what comes after." After what? After the Khan, after the empire, after all of this. She gestured vaguely at the camp, at the soldiers, at the yurts and fires and endless motion of an army that never stopped moving. Empires do not last forever. Nothing lasts forever. But we have to survive until then. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that there was an after, that time would move forward, that we would outlast the men who had taken us. But belief required energy I did not have. So I simply nodded, and we carried the water back in silence. There was a young soldier who sometimes stood guard near our yurt. He was not much older than me, maybe 17 or 18, with a face that had not yet hardened into the mask that the older soldiers wore. He did not speak to us directly, but I saw him watching, not with the eyes of the others, not with hunger or cruelty, but with something closer to confusion, as if he could not reconcile what he had been taught about honor and duty with what he saw happening around him every night. One evening, after a particularly long day, I was returning from the horses when I stumbled. My legs had simply given out, exhaustion and hunger finally catching up. I fell hard, scraping my hands on the stones. The soldier was nearby. He glanced around, checking that no one was watching, and then he stepped closer. "Can you stand?" he asked in my language, his accent thick but understandable. I looked up at him, startled. None of them had spoken to us except to give orders. I nodded slowly and tried to push myself up, but my arms shook. He hesitated. Then he reached down, not touching me, but offering his hand in a way that gave me the choice. I stared at that hand. It was calloused, scarred, the hand of someone who had spent his life holding weapons. But in that moment, it was also the first gesture of kindness I had been offered since the day my village burned. I took it. He pulled me up gently, quickly, and then stepped back, his face carefully neutral. "Be more careful," he said quietly, and then he walked away. I never spoke to him again, but I remembered that moment, not because it changed anything, not because it absolved anyone of anything, but because it reminded me that humanity, even in the smallest, most fleeting form, still existed somewhere beneath the machinery of conquest. Winter came. The steppe turned white. The wind became a blade, and the cold was so brutal that women began to die. Not from violence, from exposure, from sickness, from bodies that simply could not endure any longer. They were buried in shallow graves, if they were buried at all. Most were simply left where they fell, and the snow covered them, and by spring they were gone, erased as if they had never existed. Oyuna fell ill in the deepest part of winter. She burned with fever, her body shaking so violently that we had to hold her down to keep her from hurting herself. We begged for medicine, for a healer, for anything. We were ignored. She died on the third night, her eyes open, staring at the ceiling of the yurt, her lips moving in prayers or curses, or simply the random firing of a mind that was shutting down. We wrapped her in her blanket and carried her outside, and we dug a grave with our hands because we were not given tools, and we buried her in frozen ground that barely yielded. I spoke at her grave. Just a few words, not a prayer, because I did not know her gods, and I was not sure my own gods were listening anymore. Just words. You deserved better. You deserved to live. You deserved to go home. And then we covered her, and we went back to work, because there was nothing else to do. Spring came eventually, the snow melted, the grass returned, the army moved again, always moving, always conquering, and we moved with them. By then, I had stopped counting days. Time had lost meaning. There was only the present moment, the current task, the next breath. Some of the women who had been taken with me were no longer in the camp. Some had been sent elsewhere, to other commanders, other camps. Some had died. Some had disappeared in ways we did not speak about. And some, a few, had borne children. Children with the faces of conquerors and the blood of the conquered. I do not judge them. I do not judge anyone who survived in whatever way they could. Years passed. I stopped looking for my sister. I stopped imagining my mother's face. I stopped thinking about the river where I had grown up, the smell of bread baking, the sound of my father's voice. Those memories hurt too much, and pain was a distraction I could not afford. I became efficient, silent, useful. I learned Mongolian. I learned to anticipate needs before they were spoken. I learned to be invisible until invisibility was needed, and then to appear exactly when required. I became what they needed me to be, because that was survival. But I never forgot, not really. You do not forget the sound of your village burning. You do not forget the weight of ropes on your wrists. You do not forget the cold nights on the steppe, the women who died beside you, the prayers whispered in the dark. You do not forget the footsteps. You carry those things with you, in your bones, in your blood, in the part of your mind that wakes you in the night decades later, gasping, believing for a moment that you are still there. I am old now. The Mongol Empire, that great machine that swallowed nations, has fractured. Genghis Khan has been dead for years. His sons and grandsons fight over the pieces of what he built. The camps are gone, the yurts have been packed away, the soldiers have scattered, and I am free, or something that looks like free. I live in a small house on the edge of a city that did not exist when I was young. I have no husband, no children, no family that I know of. I survived, but survival is not the same as living. Sometimes, when the wind blows across the plains in a certain way, I hear the hooves again. I hear the screams, I hear Oyuna's prayers, and my sister's voice, and the footsteps outside the tent. And I remember that history will record Genghis Khan's conquests. It will tell of the empire that stretched from sea to sea, of the laws established, of the trade routes opened. It will speak of warriors and battles and the reshaping of the world. But it will not speak of us, of the women taken, of the daughters and wives and mothers who were ropes on carts, who hauled water, who buried their friends in frozen ground, who carried children they did not choose, who became ghosts in their own lives. History does not record our names. It does not count our losses. We are footnotes, if we are mentioned at all. Spoils of war, collateral damage, acceptable costs in the building of empires. But we existed, we suffered, we endured. And some of us, a few of us, survived long enough to remember, to bear witness, to say that we were here, that we mattered, that what happened to us was not acceptable, not necessary, not justified by conquest or destiny, or the will of gods or Khans. If you are still listening, then you have heard what history tried to bury beneath dust and bones and the endless silence of the steppe. You have heard what they did not carve into stone or sing in ballads. You have heard the voice of one woman who was taken, who survived, who refuses to let her story, our story, disappear like smoke. Stay, subscribe, before this story is lost, before the wind carries it away, before the world forgets that we were here, because some truths, no matter how painful, must be remembered. And some voices, no matter how long silenced, must finally be heard.